Well, good evening, everybody. I don't know whether we've gone live yet, but welcome everybody who's joining the call here this evening, put on by Crohn's and Colitis UK, just to help us to run through where we're up to with regards to Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis research vis-a-vis coronavirus and this wretched COVID-19, which has been causing everybody a lot of anxiety and, of course, a lot of serious illness as well. So I'm sure that many people have got questions which we would like you to feed through as we have our discussion this evening. But first of all, I'd like just to introduce the panel, if that would be okay, just so that you know a little bit about who we are and what our backgrounds are in research and indeed in treatment of Crohn's disease and colitis. I'm going to start with Karen, if that's okay. Karen, do you want to just give us a couple of minutes?
Hello, my name is Karen Kemp. I'm a consultant nurse inflammatory bowel disease at Manchester Royal Infirmary. In terms of my background in research, I'm a qualitative researcher. So I tend to concentrate on the experience and the impact of inflammatory bowel disease on the patient. So that's where I'm coming from, is really the patient perspective in terms of COVID research.
Thanks very much, Karen. Seb, do you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Sebastian. I'm one of the gastroenterologists with inflammatory bowel disease based at Hull. I do have some research interest, primarily clinical research interest in inflammatory bowel disease, and I'm very glad to be here to support this event by Crohn's and Colitis UK.
Thanks, Seb. Nick?
Hi, I'm Nick Kennedy. I'm a gastroenterologist in Exeter, Southwest. I've got a strong interest in IBD from a research perspective, and I've been involved in a number of projects now looking at IBD and COVID-19 in this difficult period. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of that with you and answering some of your questions.
Thanks, Nick. Seb, I've had a message from Mission Control that you're a little bit quiet on the speaker, so if we can get you to get your microphone a bit closer, that would be helpful. Thank you very much. My name is Miles Parks. I'm a gastroenterologist in Cambridge and I'm interested in research, particularly in genetic aspects, but also determinants of why some people get severe disease and so on and so forth. And I know a number of people on this call probably have helped us out with some of the studies that we've been doing, for example, the IBD BioResource project, which I've been asked just to say one or two words about, and I'll keep it brief because otherwise I could go on all evening about it. What's the IBD BioResource? It's a large panel of people with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis that are being recruited in over 100 hospitals around the UK, supported by Crohn's and Colitis UK, among other charitable bodies. The intention of this large panel is to allow us to really speed up the research that we do in Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. It's always been a huge roadblock, is how quickly we can recruit patients to our studies. Using the BioResource, we can send out an email to participants to say, look, we've had this proposal to do this research project. If anybody's willing, please let us know, and we can funnel you into that project without waiting for people to come through the clinics and for all this sort of thing. So that's the sort of intention of the BioResource. We do, at the time that people are enrolled in their clinics, capture quite a lot of information on them. We seek permission for access to healthcare records as well, ongoing, and also we run some genetic studies off the back of that. One of the advantages in some senses have been brought home to us by this COVID situation, whereby because we're able to link the BioResource to publicly held health records at places like Public Health England, the COVID testing database, NHS Digital, which records when people have been admitted to hospital and what happened to them. It does allow us to get some relatively speedy answers to questions. For example, and I'm going to ask Nick to just address this in a minute, in the context of the statistics around COVID-19 in IBD, because we've got 34,500 people on our database, as people on that database are diagnosed with COVID, that gets flagged onto our system, and we can understand what the impact, for example, of the drugs that they're on might have been on the course of their COVID, whether they've got better more quickly or more slowly, whether they've had a more severe disease course or a less severe disease course. So I think in many senses it's given us, I mean, we didn't want it this way, but it's given us an early illustration of the usefulness of having a large cohort of people who are plugged in and have given consent to access their healthcare records up front. There may be some questions about that, but I'm going to ask Nick just to pick up on that theme and perhaps just explain what we're doing with that study and indeed the other studies that you're involved in, Nick. And Nick is something of a maestro in the analysis of data on IBD and Crohn's disease and colitis, so we couldn't wish for anybody better in the country really to explain to you what's going on. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Miles. So as Miles says, when COVID-19 first sort of reared its head as being a big problem for the UK and for all of our patients with Crohn's and colitis, one of the early questions was how much of an influence IBD itself and in particular some of the medications we use to treat IBD would have on the risk of acquiring the infection and perhaps most importantly on the risk of severe outcomes. So Miles and I and others early on talked about using the BioResource and got data linkage between the IBD BioResource and Public Health England data to look at the risk of acquiring COVID-19, particularly among those people who've been tested, and also looking at starting to look at the risk of severe outcomes. At this stage, it's fair to say that overall, the proportion of patients tested positive for COVID-19 in the BioResource is broadly comparable to the overall positive test rate that we've seen in England and in the UK as a whole. And that suggests, although we haven't got enough data to make a completely direct comparison, it does suggest that IBD patients as a whole probably don't have a markedly increased risk of acquiring COVID-19 or at least having a positive test for the virus. We've also got an early look at some of the impact of medication. Because the overall number of patients tested is not that huge, because although we're looking at 30,000 people in the BioResource, the proportion of the positive test is still relatively a small number. That limits the amount we can say with certainty at the moment. But it doesn't look as though there's a really big signal suggesting harm from the various medications we use to treat Crohn's and colitis at this stage, which is reassuring. We've also been looking at this from a number of different angles. One of the other responses I was involved in early on was working with the IBD registry and the British Society of Gastroenterology to help patients identify where their risk fell within the risk grid that we developed as a group of gastroenterologists early on in the pandemic. We identified the fact that the hospitals had varying levels of access to high quality databases of patients with inflammatory bowel disease. And so a tool that would allow patients to input their own data and both get an idea from that about their risk, but also for those data to be fed back to their hospital, we thought would be useful. And so the IBD registry launched a tool aimed at patients, which was promoted by Crohn's Colitis UK about a week and a half after the shielding announcements were made. And there's been over 34,000 patients who've used that tool to try and get an idea about their risk. Those data, as I said, are being fed back to the hospitals of the patients treating them, and so will have been factored into the shielded patient list. We're then intending to achieve data linkage of those data with the COVID-19 testing and outcome data to try and complete that circle and understand how the risk factors that patients identified early on in the pandemic translated into their actual risk. And ideally to do that in a joined up way with the BioResource project we've already mentioned. Some of the other efforts that we've been doing looking at COVID-19 and risk in IBD, Seb Shaji is on the call, perhaps going to update you more on this in due course, but and I have been working on a project asking hospitals to identify patients with COVID-19 within their IBD communities, and also to identify how flares of IBD have been managed during the COVID-19 era.
Nick, sorry to butt in, Nick. Should we just hand over to Seb just to explain what you're doing in UK studies at the moment? Seb, do you want to just give us a flavour of what the studies that you've been organising are targeting?
Thanks, Miles. I think it's fair to say that the data so far out there, as Nick alluded to, does not necessarily give you 100% evidence whether there is increased or for that matter decreased risk of infection, or those who get the infection whether there is worsened outcome. So for that you need sort of very carefully collected data, if possible on all IBD patients with COVID infection, and also those who haven't had the infection in the respective areas. And that is one of the concepts behind what we have started of what is called the Prepare IBD study. So as the name indicates, we are trying to prepare for how our response will be guided by the evidence should there be, God forbid, any second peak of the disease or a future coronavirus. Because if you recall, a lot of our recommendations at the outset, because it is a new virus, nobody knew about this, was based upon a lot of expert opinion, which was from the experience what we had with other viruses rather than this specific virus. So hopefully the Prepare IBD study will give us a more sort of in-depth risk prediction in patients with IBD, particularly those patients with IBD who have active disease, because those are the people whom we will be using the various medications, including steroids and immunosuppressants.
Yes. So I might just ask, Seb, I might just ask Karen to comment on the sort of treatment. If people have a flare of their IBD, Karen, can you just explain the sort of thinking at the moment about not necessarily a flare, with COVID? I think that would be a complicated situation. But just at the moment, if people have a flare of their IBD, what are we doing to manage that? I mean, we're using pretty much standard care, right? But just perhaps you can explain to people with regards to that.
Yes, and one of the main things that we've been avoiding since the start of this is to avoid steroids as much as we can. So in that case, we have been using lots of topical therapy, lots of increasing the oral therapy as much as we can do so that we can avoid steroids. We have tried to avoid starting patients on the thiopurines as well during this time. And real consideration has been given to patients if we've needed to start a biologic. Those kind of decisions have been made with an IBD MDT. Yeah. But one of the main things is to really avoid steroids.
Yeah, I think that's the message that we've all taken on board. And, as time has gone on, I think it's fair to say that certainly we in Cambridge and I know elsewhere, people have got a little bit more comfortable with the idea of starting on biologic therapies, probably even azathioprine, to be honest with you. But steroids are the one real concern around that. Nick, I'm going to pitch the steroid issue at you just now, if that's okay, because it's slightly conflicting, isn't it, with the story of how good dexamethasone can be, and yet at the same time, here we are saying to try and avoid steroids if we can. Just before we get on to that, I think an important point and a question that we're often asked, reflecting the points that Seb and Nick have just made, the evidence we've got at the moment is that the immunosuppressant drugs, azathioprine, mercaptopurine, and the biologic treatments like infliximab and adalimumab and the other ones do seem to be, insofar as we can tell, pretty safe in the context of coronavirus. And that's to say, it's a mistake that people should stop those drug treatments out of fear that they may make a coronavirus situation worse, because that otherwise, the point Karen's just made, increases your likelihood of needing steroids, which we think probably make the situation worse. But Nick, what are your thoughts about steroids?
Sure. I think it's quite difficult to unpick steroids from active disease as the first thing. And there have been some of the data that's come through so far suggests active disease is more of the issue, and some suggests that steroids may be. I think in terms of the question around steroids and the phase of the virus, I think the evidence from the recovery study is that dexamethasone is useful in treating people with COVID-19 pneumonia at a point where they're requiring oxygen or ITU level support. That's where most of what's going on isn't being driven by the virus itself, but it's being driven by the body's immune response to the virus. And that's something that happens some time after the initial infection, 7 to 10 days or more. what we're talking about at the moment is people being on steroids perhaps at the point where they acquire the virus, so when they're out in the community and they're exposed to it. And although we don't have really high quality data at the moment on this, based on what we've learned from other viruses and based on some of the early data, we think that being on systemic steroids at the point of acquiring the coronavirus may be a bad thing, and therefore we're trying to minimize use of steroids where possible. But as we've already said, we think active IBD itself is probably a bad thing, and we're not saying steroids should never be used. It's just we should be considering other options where they're available.
Yeah, okay, thanks, thanks, Nick. Seb, there's a question here. Somebody's been reading about the IBD Secure database, and they raised this vexed issue about Mesalazine and the seeming increased diagnosis of COVID-19 in people on Mesalazine. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I wish we can give a definitive answer for that. The reason is that the data on 5-ASA is what is available so far, including that publication in Secure IBD, is based on a number of patients recruited from number of countries with different therapeutic or different treatment sort of regimes which are used in different countries. So it's not really a very uniform group of patients. But to me, the main thing with regard to 5-ASA is that the patients who are included in the Secure IBD registry, they were mainly patients, at least more than half of them, in fact, about 65% of them were admitted patients. Patients who are on, for example, things like infliximab or azathioprine, etc., they may have had their test done, and they may not be admitted because they are more likely to be tested when they go to the infusion unit or things like that. But 5-ASA patients, they will only be tested because they don't have any contact with the healthcare professionals otherwise. They will only be tested when they are admitted. So that may that is likely to skew the data, showing that 5-ASAs are going to cause worse outcomes in IBD patients.
Yeah, it just kind of illustrates the point, doesn't it, about how careful you have to be in interpreting these data. I think it can be quite confusing for people with Crohn's disease and colitis to see these headlines coming out and think, oh goodness me, I'm on Pentasa or Salafalk, and this thing suggests that maybe I'm at increased risk. But I think a message we would probably all endorse is to be really, really careful. And if you do have those concerns, please do talk to the people around you or the nurses and others prior to doing something radical like stopping medication and running the risk of problems. There's a couple of questions coming through on the chat now, which I'm going to come to in just a minute. But prior to that, one of the questions prior to the thing relates to children. And Karen, I'm going to just, this is slightly unfair, but in the hope that you know something about Crohn's disease and colitis in children, can we just ask for your perspective? I mean, my understanding is that children are generally, thankfully, relatively safe from COVID. Do you have any experience of this question in your own practice or others around you?
No, Miles, I'm an adult nurse.
Yes.
But yes, the data that we have on with children with Crohn's disease and colitis is that if they are affected, it's relatively mild and they do recover. So it's just to provide that reassurance to parents should their child develop COVID. But again, it's about seeking help from your IBD nurse, from your consultant, and all the factors, the child's comorbidities and everything else should be taken into account. Yeah.
So, Seb, there's a question coming through here on the chat. Early on in COVID, we heard that anti-TNF drugs might offer some protection against the virus. Is there any more information on this? Do you want to give us an update from what we know from the studies that have looked at this question, or indeed other studies that are ongoing, actually testing whether anti-TNF therapy may be an effective treatment?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting question, and it's a great deal of scientific interest too. As Nick mentioned earlier, the main problems, i.e. the problems which end you up on intensive care unit and ventilator, are the response of the body's immune system to the viral infections. And one of the molecules or what we call as mediators, which are involved in that exaggerated immune system response to the virus infection, is actually TNF. So it may logically suggest that if you have anti-TNF, that may be somewhat beneficial. Now, TNF is not the only molecule which is released in this so-called cytokine storm. So there are a number of other molecules. So TNF alone is not the culprit. Now,
do you want to talk to us about some of the other ideas there are there, and what drug treatments are being used to try and modify that immune response, Seb?
Yes, there are a number of studies which are going on looking at other cytokines, something what is called IL-6, which is tocilizumab, not used in IBD, but used in rheumatology literature. But there are some sister compounds of that which were just about to go on trials for IBD when COVID struck us in March. There is in fact actually a trial of anti-TNF going on at the moment in Boston, which is using infliximab, which is given to all admitted patients within 6 hours of their admission. These are not IBD patients, these are patients who have developed COVID. So that might give us more definitive information. But the important thing is, from the secure IBD registry, if any, the anti-TNF appears to be certainly safe, and there is perhaps an early signal that it may have a marginal level of protection. Now, whether we can't read too much into it because of the reasons I explained earlier, but at the moment, the key message, like Miles said, should be that I wouldn't change the medication unless there is a valid and definitive reason in discussion with your healthcare professional.
So Seb, you make an important point, which is that there are almost, I mean, it's maybe probably too naive to suggest this, but there are sort of 2 phases to this illness. Well, there are probably multiple phases to the illness, but the viral infection itself and the things that increase your risk of contracting the virus are rather different from the things that mean you have a severe disease course. And, you know, it's true to say that the majority of people who get coronavirus don't need to be admitted to hospital and are able to sit that out at home, albeit pretty nasty. But that by the time people come to hospital and are admitted to hospital, they're already in quite a severe group, a severe subgroup. And I think that's been one of the reasons why well, certainly in the early days of this epidemic, saw these really frightening statistics about the proportion of people diagnosed, because the only people being diagnosed were the people turning up to the hospital, and what the poor outcomes were among them, primarily because at that stage, at least, there was a bit of an underappreciation of the fact that there was the majority of people who were getting it more mildly and either being asymptomatic or getting a relatively mild illness and which could be managed at home. Nick, I want to just come on to the question, this has come through on the chat as well, about the risk categories. You've done a great job in helping to put together the risk stratification tool, which I would like you to put a quick advert out for, just to show how people can access that. But also just to address the question as to whether that's a platform for research, and also whether the risk categories themselves may be adjusted in the light of the knowledge which Seb has just been talking about.
Yes, so the risk categorization that we did as the British Society of Gastroenterology, there were a group of us from around the UK who came together to develop this guidance at quite short notice. When we first did that back in March, we had relatively limited data on COVID-19. There was a little from China and from Italy, but still a lot of unknowns. And so quite a lot of what we did, we had to extrapolate from other infections. We have had a further discussion about the risk categories themselves a few weeks ago. And although there have been some more data come through, particularly from secure IBD that's been mentioned already, I guess with the knowledge that there's several projects ongoing which should hopefully deliver results in the near future, it was felt that we needed a bit more before we would actually make changes, and we didn't want to make changes unnecessarily and cause confusion by having sort of rapid changes in the guidance. I guess the precise sort of relevance of which category one falls into is changing, because at the end of this month, the government is sort of winding down the current shielding programme and really recommending that people in that highest risk group practice stringent social distancing, which is what the moderate risk group were already being advised to practice. And of course, all of us should, to some degree, be trying to practice social distancing as much as possible to reduce our risk of acquiring this virus. So it perhaps matters precisely which category one falls into a bit less, but I think the importance of that may increase again if we do, and hopefully we don't, but if we do see a sort of further wave where the rate of infections increases again, and if there are further moves to protect specific groups of people, then clearly that becomes much more important again. I mentioned earlier the tool. This is on the IBD Registry's webpage, and Crohn's and Colitis UK also linked to this from their pages, and it's still open for anyone to register their details and put in their information about their disease and their other health problems and their medication, and get an idea about risk. We're also intending to go back to people who've used the tool to find out what the outcomes of that were in terms of whether they did actually shield and whether they acquired coronavirus, which will help us understand much better what the risks were if we face a second wave of the virus.
Thanks, Nick. And it's an important point, isn't it, that still a lot of the risk relating to coronavirus comes back to the nothing to do with IBD. It's age and diabetes and hypertension and heart disease. Yeah. These are the things, as I understand it, that sort of dominate the outlook. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And we are trying to do some bigger pieces of work as well, which we can talk about more in perhaps if we have another Facebook Live, but it's a bit early to discuss now. But looking at how this works across immune-mediated disease and how that so other things like rheumatoid arthritis and other diseases, right, and how that relates to the other health problems that people have, as you've described.
Yeah, okay. There's a question coming through on the chat about whether, and Karen, I'm going to pitch this one at you, and this is the VEX question. I'm not sure we know the answer to this. Can COVID either trigger Crohn's disease or colitis, or in people who have already got Crohn's and colitis, can it trigger a flare-up? Have you seen any examples of this coming through in your own practice? Do you know anything about the literature on this? I think it's all a bit mixed at the moment.
Yes, it is a bit mixed. There is, we know that if patients develop a gastroenteritis, that they can develop a post-irritable bowel syndrome type of effect. Yeah. We have had patients who have developed COVID and they have had gastrointestinal symptoms, yeah, and then it's trying to tease out whether this is their inflammatory bowel disease or whether this is the effects of COVID. So yes, we have seen patients who have developed these symptoms. It's not tended to be a flare, and the gastrointestinal symptoms have settled down. Yeah. So I have found that it's a case of reassuring the patients and saying to them, just give it a few more days and let's see if these do settle down, if it's COVID related.
Yes, and it's a good point.
Time, yeah.
It's a good point, well made, Karen, that in the early phases, particularly of the COVID virus illness, it can create, as you say, tummy upset, and one of the ways that it can present is with diarrhea. Nick, briefly, your thoughts about virus shedding and IBD and mucosal immunity and all that stuff?
I think there's still a lot of unknowns. We should be in a position to do some research more specifically into shedding of virus in the stool within the UK. We've seen, and people have been doing this elsewhere. There's certainly evidence that you can detect virus in stool, or whether that has implications for infection is still not fully understood. I don't think we know enough about the mucosal response in patients specifically with inflammatory bowel disease to draw any firm conclusions about whether it's likely to cause flares. Seb, you've obviously been looking as much, perhaps more than anyone else, at the intersection between active IBD and COVID-19. I know it's early to report on what's going on in PREPARE, but do you have any feel for whether there's an actual association between flares and COVID-19 itself?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. As we know, all our clinical research will have some scientific or basic science background. And if you look at basic science, which is laboratory evidence, it does seem to be plausible that those patients who have active inflammation or their lining or mucosa is, if you like, hot, there may be a slightly higher risk of the virus passing through or getting into the body, and perhaps the amount of virus which gets into the body may be higher in those who have active inflammation. So there is some, if you like, from the lab data coming through indicating that. Now, is that clinically relevant? And that is one of the questions being asked in the study which Nick and I are coordinating, called the PREPARE, and in a specific group of patients with the severe colitis, what's called the PROTECT study. Hopefully the data from that will help us to identify whether these people who have severe or active disease, or particularly severe active disease, are they at increased risk of, first of all, getting the virus, and if they do get the virus, are they at worse risk of outcomes? We have one study so far from Italy, a small study, which suggested that maybe the active disease is a risk factor for getting COVID-related pneumonia.
Okay, thank you for that summary, Seb. I want to just move on briefly, because we've not got a huge amount more time, just to think about some of the vaccines and the vaccine studies in particular at the moment, but also then the potential for vaccines themselves when they come through, hopefully, to be used in people with IBD. Nick, can I bowl that question at you in the first instance? The question about vaccine studies, and where are we up to with those?
Sure. So there have been a couple of studies that have released early results today in the Lancet, and this I've certainly seen it in Sky News and BBC News, which I'd imagine means it's in most other mainstream UK news sources. One was from China and one's from the UK, from Oxford, and these are both showing promising results using a particular type of vaccine where there's an adenovirus, a different type of virus that carries the relevant protein to try and make the body think it's seeing the coronavirus, so that when it sees the coronavirus later, it can respond. And the early results, both in terms of safety and in terms of an appropriate response to the vaccine, in terms of antibodies and other types of vaccine response, look encouraging, which is good news, because we obviously want to see a successful vaccine to prevent this illness, and that should hopefully allow us to get much more back to normal life. We are in the earlier phases of planning a study specifically to look at using a vaccine, and it's one idea that's been shown to be successful in general, specifically in patients with inflammatory bowel disease, and looking at whether the treatments we use to treat inflammatory bowel disease have an effect on vaccine response. We don't think, although the studies at the moment have excluded people on immune suppressants, we think it's unlikely, based on what we know at the moment, that the immune suppressants would increase the risk associated with the vaccines, although we won't know for sure at this stage. But the reason for doing such a study in patients with inflammatory bowel disease is a concern that the treatments we use might have an effect on how effective the vaccines are. And we know that from some other vaccinations, that some of the drugs we use to treat IBD can reduce the effectiveness of some vaccines, but it varies from one vaccine to another. So it's important we understand that specifically with the treatments we're using for IBD.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Nick. I'm mindful that time is against us now, so I'm just going to back through. In fact, I might take one or two of these questions myself. There's a question about the stem cell trial in Crohn's disease, the ASTIC Light study, which has been paused. I don't know whether that's going to restart or not. The question was, will that one get back up and running? The reason it was stopped is that study produces a very profound degree of immunosuppression, which is clearly not safe in the context of something like coronavirus. With regards to other drug trials in Crohn's disease, they are now beginning to get back up and running. And so we run a study called the Profile trial of people with newly diagnosed Crohn's disease, and we've just reopened that for recruitment. And I know some of the commercial drugs trials as well are just beginning to get going again now. And so for people who are for people who are already participating in them, you probably have just carried on and just been doing the visits remotely. Other new recruits may find the opportunity for that. What about non-medical research? Any social research taking place? I'm far from an expert in this. I'm happy to have anybody else pitching in here. I'm sure there has been significant psychological problems relating to lockdown. Anxiety rates have been up. And sadly, we are seeing quite a lot of people with quite serious psychiatric problems relating to the lockdown. And so I think we need to take that seriously, and we might expect that that would impact on risk of Crohn's disease and colitis flaring, although I've not myself seen that. Karen, do you want to step in?
Yes, we are just in the process of setting up a qualitative study to look at the experience of patients who, with IBD and COVID, the experience of shielding, their fears, concerns, and how they have coped with the shielding and all of that. And this will sit very well in with a piece of work which Nick and the registry are starting to develop as well. So on the one hand, I've got a very good in-depth qualitative piece of work in setup, and then Nick is looking at a much larger survey. If Nick, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, we're hoping to look at the patient experience during the COVID-19 era, and we've looked at, in conjunction with Seb, we looked at how IBD services adapted to the pandemic early on. We did a survey back in April. We're keen to repeat that survey of services, but in particular to look at patients and whether they had difficulty accessing their IBD service, whether it's through the helpline or through appointments, and what their experience was like of that and the impact it's had on them. As Miles has said, lockdown itself, but also the difficulty some people have had in accessing health services will have had a real impact on patients during this period. And we know that helplines, from the survey that we did earlier on, and also just from talking to our IBD nurses, we know helplines have been very, very busy, but have often had to deal with that with lower numbers of nurses available. Yeah.
Just perhaps as we begin to wrap up, and I'm going to ask each of you just to reflect on where you see this all going in the research world, at least, in a moment. Seb, there's a question here about what coronavirus symptoms might look like in somebody who's immunosuppressed. Would we expect it to present in a similar way with similar symptoms? Do you think they're less likely to get a fever, or exactly what's your sense of that? I don't know that I've got enough experience to bring to bear on this.
I think whatever data what we have now available, there is no difference in relation to presentation, i.e. these are admitted patients you're talking about, between those who have IBD or those who do not have IBD. But as I alluded to earlier, that patients who are on immunosuppressive drugs and biologic drugs who have been tested positive out in the community, who have not been admitted, clearly have less severe symptoms, and that's why they have not ended up in the hospital. So my own feeling or my impression from the literature so far is that perhaps they may have milder severity of symptoms. And I do hope it remains like that in the future studies which are coming out.
Okay, thanks, Seb. So mindful of the time, I'm just going to begin to wrap up now, if that's okay, and perhaps just ask each member of the panel just for their final thoughts or reflections about research in the COVID era. And Karen, over to you to just lead us off, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think now we will see much more research looking into, as you say, the psychological aspect of COVID with patients with inflammatory bowel disease, both the shielding aspect of it and the future of it. Everything is uncertain. So, and this has all had a massive impact on our patients. So I think we will see a lot more of these sorts of studies being developed.
Yeah, and you can't understate how important that is. Actually, it's really a critical thing. Seb, over to you for a wrap-up comment.
As Nick mentioned, hopefully in another few months' time, with all the number of studies which the group, the UK IBD community have started, we will have a little bit more clarity on some of those key questions which you have put, particularly in relation to the drug, disease activity, etc. One thing perhaps which I would like to see also being done is that, as is the case with the population as a whole, we are all going to be behaving slightly differently. Our lives have changed somewhat, and it's likely to remain changed for some time. Perhaps the impact of those changes on your healthcare resource utilization and also access to healthcare, those are things which we need to think carefully as clinicians and researchers.
Okay, thank you, Seb. Nick?
Yeah, so I think the COVID-19 period so far has accelerated some of the changes already taking place, both in clinical delivery of service, but also research towards being able to deliver clinical services and research remotely. And in the case of the important data around clinical symptoms and even things like medication and other health problems, a move towards acquiring a greater proportion of that information directly from patients rather than relying on research teams to enter that themselves. I think those are positive steps. I think it will broaden access to research to patients. It may open up possibility of running studies that involve patients from a less research active centre, if more of it can be done from the centre. Although I think it's also really important that we don't end up with digital exclusion where people who have less access to the internet and to other such platforms are less able to participate than they would otherwise want to. And it's important we maintain inclusion for everyone.
Thank you, Nick. I would agree with all of those sentiments as expressed by everybody. And to me, it has underlined the potential usefulness of some of the existing data resources and big data research, and how we can use that to get answers to questions quite quickly in a way that that hopefully will propel research and be really useful for us. So I'm going to wrap up now. I would just like to say thank you to Crohn's and Colitis UK for putting on this event this evening. There's a lot more information on the Crohn's and Colitis UK website about research in general, but also COVID and coronavirus research in particular. So if people have got residual questions, they want to know how to get more involved in the sorts of research studies that are going on, then please do visit that website. We really can't do any of this research without people actively participating and or giving us your permission for us to use your data. This is, it's fundamental to how we make progress in IBD. So we're very grateful to you all for your help in that regard, and just could encourage you to continue in that vein. That's the way that we make progress. Good, so I'm going to sign off now. I think we're going to be shut down on the Zoom machine. We're all getting a bit square-eyed with Zoom anyway, so it's probably a good thing. But suffice to say thank you to the panel that we've had this evening, Karen and Nick and Seb, and thank you to Crohn's and Colitis UK, and thank you to all of you at home for joining us this evening. Okay, bye-bye.